The door clicked open. That was all it took. One door. One moment of institutional trust misplaced. And Charles Victor Thompson, a man convicted of 3 murders, a man sitting on death row, walked out of Harris County Jail in broad daylight. He wasn't smuggled out. He didn't tunnel through concrete. He didn't overpower a guard. He simply walked through a door that someone opened for him. It was September 2005. Texas. A state that executes more prisoners than any other in America. A state whose criminal justice system is legendary for its severity. And yet, a death row inmate had just vanished. The question that would haunt investigators, corrections officers, and the victims' families for the next 10 days wasn't just where is he, it was how. How does a man awaiting execution for triple murder just leave? And the answer, when it finally came, was more disturbing than anyone expected. Because it said less about Charles Thompson's cunning, and more about how easily a broken system can be exploited by someone who has nothing left to lose. This is the full story. The murders that put him there. The escape that shocked Texas. The manhunt that followed. And the execution chamber he could not outrun forever. If this kind of story grips you, hit subscribe right now. Every week we go deep inside the cases the headlines forgot. You won't want to miss what's coming. 3 people were dead and Charles Victor Thompson thought he had gotten away with it. It was 1998. Houston, Texas. Thompson had recently broken up with his girlfriend, Denise Hayslip. By most accounts, the split was not clean. Thompson did not accept it. And when he discovered that Denise had moved on, that she was seeing someone new, a man named Darren Kane, something in him hardened into something irreversible. On the night of November 10, 1998, Thompson went to the home Denise shared with Darren Kane. What happened inside that house took only minutes. When it was over, Denise Hayslip and Darren Kane were both dead, shot multiple times. A third person, Joey McGee, was also killed. McGee was there, witnesses would later testify, and that alone made him a threat to Thompson's freedom. 3 lives. One night. A man who believed he could control the consequences. He couldn't. Harris County investigators built their case methodically. The physical evidence, witness testimony, and circumstantial trail all pointed to Thompson. He was arrested, charged with capital murder, and stood trial. In 2000, a Harris County jury convicted him on all counts. The same jury, weighing the evidence of 3 deliberate killings, sentenced him to death. Thompson was transferred to the Huntsville Unit in Livingston, Texas, home of Texas death row. Let that place settle in your mind for a moment. Huntsville is not a prison in the way most people imagine prisons. It is an exercise in deliberate isolation. Death row inmates at Huntsville are housed in single-man cells, approximately 60 square feet each. They spend 22 to 23 hours per day alone in that space. No congregate dining. No shared recreation. The outside world exists only through a narrow window and whatever books or legal documents an inmate can accumulate. For most men sent to Huntsville, the psychological weight of that isolation, combined with the knowledge of what waits at the end, is crushing. The average time between sentencing and execution in Texas stretches across years, sometimes decades, as appeals wind through the courts. A man on death row lives in a specific kind of suspended torment, aware of the date of his death in the abstract, but never quite knowing when the abstractions will become concrete. Thompson filed his appeals. The courts reviewed them. And as the years passed, it began to appear that the system was working exactly as designed, slowly, methodically, inexorably. But Thompson was watching the system back. He had time. More time than most men can bear, but he used it differently. He studied. Not law, primarily, though death row inmates become intimately acquainted with legal procedure out of pure survival instinct. Thompson studied people. He studied the rhythms of the facility. He studied the transfer procedures, the paperwork flows, the points at which the Harris County jail system and the TDCJ system intersected. Because Thompson was not always at Huntsville. Death row inmates in Texas are periodically transported back to the county where they were convicted, Harris County, for hearings related to their appeals. These transfers meant time inside Harris County Jail. A different facility, different personnel, different procedures, different vulnerabilities. What investigators would later piece together was that Thompson used those transfer periods to do something extraordinarily calculated for a man in his position. He cultivated a relationship. He identified a person within the system, a civilian connected to the jail, and he worked that relationship with patience and precision. Her name was Renee Garza. She was a former Harris County Jail employee, and by September 2005, she was willing to help Charles Thompson do the unthinkable. The plan, when it came, was almost insultingly simple. On September 26, 2005, Charles Victor Thompson was inside Harris County Jail, transferred there for a court proceeding related to his ongoing appeals. At some point during his time in the facility, he obtained civilian clothing. And then, dressed not as a prisoner but as an ordinary man, he approached a jail employee and claimed to be an attorney's investigator, someone with legitimate business inside the facility, and therefore legitimate reason to leave. The door opened. He walked out. The most dangerous man Harris County had processed in years was gone. And it took staff an agonizing amount of time, hours, to realize it. 10 days. That is how long Charles Victor Thompson was free. 10 days in which the state of Texas, a corrections apparatus that processes hundreds of thousands of inmates and is legendarily punishing in its administration, could not locate one man who had walked out of a county jail in broad daylight. The escape was discovered within hours of Thompson's departure on September 26, 2005. The U.S. Marshals Service was immediately activated. Harris County Sheriff's Department launched its own parallel search. Texas law enforcement circulated Thompson's photographs statewide. The assumption, the urgent, chilling assumption, was simple. A man convicted of 3 murders facing execution had nothing left to restrain him. He was considered armed and extremely dangerous. The manhunt spread outward from Houston in concentric rings. Investigators canvassed motels, bus stations, and border crossings. Thompson's known associates were contacted. His family was watched. Every lead was pursued with the particular urgency that attaches to escaped death row inmates, a category so rare in Texas that the protocols for it had barely been stress-tested. Because it almost never happens. Texas death row is not a place men escape from. Between the physical security of Polunsky, the isolation of the cells, and the layers of oversight built into the transfer system, the statistical likelihood of a successful escape was considered vanishingly small. And yet here they were. What investigators were also doing, simultaneously, was reconstructing exactly how it happened. And as the picture clarified, the alarm deepened, not just because Thompson was free, but because of what his escape revealed about the system's soft underbelly. Renee Garza, the former jail employee, quickly became central to the investigation. She was charged in connection with the escape, accused of facilitating Thompson's acquisition of civilian clothing and his departure from the facility. Her arrest came while Thompson was still at large. When asked to explain how a death row inmate had charmed a former employee into complicity, investigators kept returning to the same uncomfortable truth. The relationship had been built over time. It was not impulsive. It was strategic. Thompson had studied who to target. He had identified someone susceptible. Someone who, for reasons the investigation would explore, was willing to cross a line most people in her position would never approach. And he had worked that vulnerability with the patience of a man who had years and nothing else to spend. This is a pattern that corrections experts identify repeatedly when analyzing prison escapes. The most successful escapes, those that don't involve violence or tunnels or physical force, rely on social engineering. On finding the human variable inside a system designed to minimize human error. On being, above all, persuasive. Thompson had 10 days to prove he was persuasive enough to survive outside the system too. He headed south. Evidence gathered after his recapture placed him in the direction of Mexico, a logical destination for a fugitive in Texas seeking to put jurisdictional distance between himself and pursuit. He moved carefully, avoiding obvious choke points, using cash where possible, staying mobile. For 10 days he vanished. But the Marshals task force was not static. It was triangulating. Following digital traces, financial transactions, tips from the public, informant networks. The noose, and that word in this context carries an uncomfortable literalness, was slowly tightening. On October 6, 2005, 10 days after he walked out of Harris County Jail, Charles Victor Thompson was located in Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, just across the border from Laredo, Texas. Mexican authorities, working in coordination with U.S. law enforcement, took him into custody. He was brought back across the border. He was returned to Texas. And whatever slim, desperate hope he had nurtured during those 10 days of freedom, whatever calculations he had run about new identities, about distance, about time, all of it collapsed the moment the handcuffs went back on. The death warrant was still valid. The sentence had not changed. The only thing that had changed was that the state of Texas was now very, very motivated to make sure Charles Victor Thompson reached his execution date without further incident. The aftermath inside Harris County Jail was significant. Sheriff Tommy Thomas ordered a full review of procedures governing the transfer and housing of high-security inmates. The investigation into René Garza proceeded. Policy changes were implemented. Changes specifically designed to close the gap that Thompson had exploited. For the families of Denise Hayslip, Darren Kane and Joey McGee, the escape had been a 10-day ordeal layered on top of years of legal proceedings. They had already endured the trial, the sentencing, the long corridor of appeals. And now they had been forced to endure the possibility, briefly, horribly real, that the man who killed their loved ones might simply disappear. He hadn't. But the fear had been real. Thompson was returned to Polunsky. Back to the 60-square-foot cell. Back to the 23-hour isolation. Back to the slow machinery of Texas death penalty appeals. Except now the machinery had a renewed urgency around his case. The appeals took years. That is the design. The Texas death penalty system is not built for speed. It is built for what its architects describe as certainty, the exhaustive procedural verification that a conviction is sound before the state carries out an irreversible act. In practice, this means layers of state and federal review. Direct appeal to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. Habeas corpus petitions at the state level. Federal habeas proceedings in the U.S. District Courts. Applications to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Petitions to the United States Supreme Court. For Charles Victor Thompson, this process extended for years after his 2000 conviction, and was complicated but not halted by his 2005 escape. His legal team raised multiple issues through the appellate process. Questions about jury selection, about the adequacy of counsel, about procedural matters at trial. These are the standard vectors of death penalty appeals, not because defense attorneys are cynical, but because the standard of proof required to take a human life demands that every procedural stone be turned. The courts turned them, and found them insufficient to overturn the conviction or vacate the sentence. By 2009, Thompson's appeals had been largely exhausted. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles reviewed his case. An execution date was set, November 19, 2009. This is the moment that death row inmates and their families describe as qualitatively different from everything that precedes it. A man can live on death row for a decade, even 2 decades, with the knowledge of his sentence. But the setting of a specific date transforms that abstract knowledge into something viscerally, unbearably concrete. A clock appears. It runs in one direction only. For the families of Denise Hayslip, Darren Kane and Joey McGee, November 19 was also a date that arrived with complicated emotional weight. Victims' families who attend executions, and not all choose to, often describe the experience as simultaneously providing closure and reopening wounds. The legal system offers them a seat in the witness room. It does not tell them how to feel about what they see. Thompson, in the days before his execution, gave a final interview. He continued to maintain, as he had throughout his post-conviction proceedings, that he was innocent of the murders. This was a position his legal team had pressed through the appeals. The claim that the evidence against him was insufficient, that the jury had been wrongly persuaded. The courts had repeatedly disagreed. But in the particular theater of a death row inmate's final days, that claim takes on a different texture. Not because the courts were wrong to reject it, they had heard it, evaluated it and found it wanting. But because it is part of the human architecture of these cases. The tension between institutional certainty and a condemned man's insistence on his own version of events. What is verifiable is this: 3 people were killed in Harris County in November 1998. A jury of 12 people heard all of the evidence available at trial, deliberated, and concluded that Charles Victor Thompson was responsible. Multiple courts reviewed that conclusion over nearly a decade of appeals. None overturned it. On the evening of November 19, 2009 at the Huntsville Unit, known as The Walls, Texas performed its 447th execution since reinstating the death penalty in 1982. Charles Victor Thompson was strapped to the gurney in the execution chamber. The room is small. The walls are institutional green. A single window separates the execution chamber from 2 witness rooms, one for the victim's family, one for the condemned's family and invited witnesses. A microphone is available for a final statement. Thompson made his final statement. He addressed the people in the room. And then the lethal injection protocol, a 3-drug sequence that Texas has used across hundreds of executions, was administered. He was pronounced dead at 6:28 p.m. The man who had walked out of a county jail 4 years earlier. The man who had made it to Mexico. The man whose escape had triggered policy reviews and criminal charges and a 10-day manhunt across 2 countries. Was gone. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel goes places others won't. Subscribe now and hit the bell, The next video is already waiting for you, and trust me, you're not going to want to miss it. Texas executes more people than any other state in America. That is not a political statement, it is a documented statistical fact, confirmed by the Death Penalty Information Center's records tracking state-by-state execution totals since the reinstatement of capital punishment following the Supreme Court's 1976 Gregg v. Georgia decision. By the time Charles Victor Thompson was executed in November 2009, Texas had carried out more than 440 executions since 1982. The machinery of Texas capital punishment, from the Huntsville Unit where inmates wait, to the Walls Unit in Huntsville where executions occur, is the most practiced execution system in the United States. This context matters because it shapes everything about how Thompson's case was processed, how his appeals were handled, how urgently his escape was treated, and how little procedural flexibility existed once his final appeals were exhausted. But the Thompson case does not exist in a vacuum. It illuminates several specific, documented tensions within the American death penalty system. The first is the question of escape risk. Before September 2005, Texas corrections administrators would have rated the escape risk for death row inmates in transit as extremely low. The systems in place, the transfer protocols, the personnel screening, the physical security, had been tested across hundreds of death row inmates moved between Pulaski and Harris County Jail for court proceedings. They had not failed catastrophically before. Thompson's escape forced a fundamental re-examination. When a system fails, the instinct is to identify the specific vulnerability and close it. In this case, the vulnerability was human, a former employee who had maintained contact with an inmate and was willing to cross a critical line. The corrective response, tighter controls on civilian contact with inmates, enhanced screening of transfer procedures, stricter protocols around inmate clothing during transport, addressed the specific mechanism of the escape. But corrections experts who analyzed the case pointed to a broader issue, the social engineering problem. Thompson had not broken through a wall. He had manipulated a person. And the most sophisticated physical security in the world cannot fully neutralize the human variable. This is a lesson that keeps recurring across documented cases of prison escapes nationally. The ones that succeed almost always involve someone on the inside, someone whose cooperation was cultivated over time. The second tension the Thompson case illuminates is the position of victims' families within the capital punishment process. For the families of Denise Hayslip, Darren Kane, and Joey McGee, the legal process that followed the 1998 murders stretched across more than a decade. A trial, a conviction, a death sentence, years of appeals, an escape, a recapture, more proceedings, an execution date, and finally an execution. Researchers and victim advocates who study families' experiences with capital cases consistently document a complex emotional reality. The expectation, sometimes encouraged by the justice system itself, is that execution will bring closure. The experience for many families is more ambiguous. The legal process demands repeated engagement over years. Families must relive the facts of the original crime through hearings and proceedings. The escape, in Thompson's case, re-injected acute fear into a process that was supposed to be moving toward resolution. Some family members of victims in capital cases have described the wait for execution as its own form of prolonged suffering, not because they oppose the punishment, but because the length of the process makes it difficult to begin rebuilding any sense of normalcy. Others describe the execution itself as a hollow moment, the legal conclusion to a loss that never actually concludes. The Thompson case in this respect is not unique. It is representative of a structural feature of American capital punishment, the enormous temporal gap between crime and execution, and the effect of that gap on everyone touched by the original act of violence. The third tension is the escape itself as a data point. In the entire history of Texas death row, documented escapes are extraordinarily rare. Thompson's case stands as one of the most studied examples of how transfer vulnerability, the moment when inmates move between facilities, represents the highest risk window in an otherwise tightly controlled system. His case directly informed policy revisions that remained in effect long after his execution. In this way, Charles Victor Thompson's story contributed, despite everything, to the hardening of the system designed to contain and ultimately execute men like him. Charles Victor Thompson died on a gurney in Huntsville, Texas, on November 19, 2009. He was 35 years old. The execution required a few minutes from start to finish. The 3-drug lethal injection protocol, sedative, paralytic, potassium chloride, proceeded without complication. His last statement, delivered in the execution chamber, maintained the position he had held since his conviction. that he had not committed the murders. The courts had heard that claim across 9 years and multiple layers of review. They had not been persuaded. He was pronounced dead. His body was released. And the Huntsville Unit moved on to the next case on the docket, as it always does, because the machinery of Texas capital punishment does not pause for reflection. But the case didn't end with Thompson's death. Cases rarely do. Renee Garza, the former Harris County Jail employee charged with facilitating the escape, faced legal proceedings of her own. She had enabled a triple murderer to walk out of a secure facility. The consequences of that decision, the 10-day manhunt, the terror that had attended his freedom, the resources expended, were all traceable to her choices. Her case moved through the courts separately, part of the institutional accounting that follows every major security failure. The Harris County Jail implemented its procedural reforms. Pulaski Unit continued to house the inmates Texas courts sent there. The transfer protocols that Thompson had exploited were hardened. And the specific combination of factors that had allowed his escape, civilian contact, clothing access, and under-verified social engineering play, became case study material for corrections administrators. In the broader architecture of American criminal justice, the Thompson case sits at a precise intersection. The death penalty, prison security, victim impact, and the human capacity for manipulation under conditions of extreme confinement. There are people who will look at this story and see an argument against capital punishment, the long years on death row, the complexity of the appeals, the question of certainty in a system capable of error. There are people who will see an argument for the system's ultimate reliability. He was convicted by a jury, reviewed by multiple courts, escaped, was recaptured, and was ultimately executed as sentenced. The machine worked, they would say. Slowly. Imperfectly. But it worked. What is beyond argument is the human reality at the center of the story. 3 people, Denise Hayslip, Darren Kane, Joey McGee, did not get any of those years. They did not get appeals or hearings or transfer days or a final statement. They got one November night in 1998. And then nothing. That is the fact that sits underneath all the procedural complexity. Underneath the escape drama and the manhunt and the policy reforms and the execution protocols. Underneath the legal arguments and the clemency petitions and the court's rolling rejections of each appeal. 3 people were killed. Their families carried what followed. And the state of Texas, moving at the speed that its machinery allows, eventually extracted the punishment its courts had determined was appropriate. Whether that extraction brought justice, and what justice even means in this context, is a question the legal system cannot answer. It can only return verdicts. The living are left to determine what those verdicts mean. Charles Victor Thompson was the 447th person executed in Texas since 1982. By the time you finish watching this video, that number will be higher. The machine doesn't stop. You just watched the full story of one of the most brazen death row escapes in Texas history, and the system that eventually caught up with Charles Thompson. If this kind of deep dive documentary storytelling is what you're here for, subscribe right now. Every week we go inside the cases that define American criminal justice. The escapes, the executions, the systems, and the people caught inside them. The next video is already waiting. Click it. You won't regret it.